Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Everyone, inshallah, today is actually going to be our first day for the fiqh of marriage. Fiqh of marriage, inshallah, we're going to be covering multiple issues in regards to the fiqh of marriage, every single thing about marriage. It's going to be a total of approximately, I would say, 20 lectures to probably maybe max 25 lectures, but hopefully we'll be covering everything in regards to fiqh of marriage. It's going to be at this time, so we're looking at, 22 minutes before this time, okay? That will be, Monday, my day, your day will be a Sunday at this time, and also your day on a Friday, but my day on a Saturday at this time, okay? So that would be your time, that would be a Friday and a Sunday. A Friday and a Sunday? Yeah. Well, yeah. Am I right? Yes, that's what it will be. Okay, so 2 times a week. We've got a lot of topics to talk about. We do have a book for it, so just stay tuned. So the course overview, we'll be talking about just different topics like marriage contracts, the different things that relate to marriage contracts. We'll be talking about divorce. We'll be talking about khula. We'll be talking about fasq. You should be capable of answering pretty much all the questions that relate to marriage, that relate to divorce, that relate to child custody, manners in marriage relations, things that relate to far or relatives and far relatives, and just different the structure and familyhood in society. And of course, it will depend on the 4 major schools. So I will be talking about the 4 major schools often and sometimes even more. And the reason for that is this class will be kind of like a foundational class for those that just want to know their rights and responsibilities and perhaps give advice even on Islam, whether we're speaking about marriage therapists or whether we're speaking about just your own personal life, just your own self, wanting to educate yourself on the fiqh of marriage, or whether we're speaking about even those that are probably experts trying to, I guess, get fiqh of marriage in Islam and what that looks like. So whether we're speaking about marriage therapists, we're talking about counselors, we're talking about maybe lawyers, etc. This is definitely a class for all. That's why I will be going in depth in different schools as well, because I don't like staying on just one fatwa. And it's really important to see what other schools follow just to help you know farther than just one fatwa, just for you to also get, let's call it a wider range of vision on Islamic law in regards to fiqh of marriage. Okay. It may sound confusing, but inshallah, we'll break it down. And fiqh is my thing. And once I get into fiqh, you just will see me kind of like going into these sailing moments and surfing. Let's do it that way. We'll be surfing into the different opinions. We'll be talking about fiqh. We'll be talking about marriage. We'll be talking about various opinions in regards to rights and responsibilities. Is this a woman's right? Is this not? How do scholars actually debate this one? And what do we basically understand from all of this? And this is going to be covering, like I said, marriage contracts, engagement, ruling on divorces, and so forth. And we'll also be, inshallah, trying to cover it in slides. So the best thing to do is that I basically had a slide or an area where you could actually go to in order to see all those slides that relate to our subject. So I'm going to show you right there. This is basically our place. And it's right there, aishawazwaz.wordpress.com, even though it hadn't been actually, no, I mean, I didn't update it to probably maybe in, I don't know, maybe in 10 years. I actually lost the password for updating this website. So now it's basically there. This vlog is there, and I think I did it maybe what? maybe 14 years ago, but it's still there. Okay, it's still there. So anyhow, I will give you the link for this. And what you see is that it would give you a syllabus and there are slides for the class. Each and every single one of these is basically a PowerPoint slide and it contains all the different things. So here we go. You got 21 different slides here and they're available to you. And plus it has some references to go to, but these references are actually in Arabic. So I got you another English reference, which is this book. This is a really good book that I came across. Let me first give you maybe the link. Okay, so this is, if you were to just go Google Aisha Wazwaz and family fiqh, it should open up for you, but I'll also put it in the chat right there. There's the other one, which is this book. I like this book because number one, the English language is actually pretty good. The second thing is that it's a concise presentation on fiqh. Kind of think of it as the summary for fiqh. So he'll go in all these different details on fiqh. It's a pretty huge book. It is 700 pages, but look, you have it right there in a PDF available to you. What more can you get? And it's basically right there for free for you to take. And at the same time, it covers each and every single topic on fiqh. So that's why I actually loved it, because it basically covers, let's look at that, kind of, just look at what a fiqh book would look like, just to give you an idea. Okay, this is what a fiqh book would basically be covering. So here's the part about marriage right there. So it would tell me 367. Let's actually get that 367 and see what we get. And let's see, here we go. See, you can go to the glossary and then you can actually find the page that you want. So here's the book, like I said, available to you. Very good translation. That was definitely worth getting that PhD by Amja. Amja gave the person, Jamed Zarabozo, actually gave him a PhD, an honorary PhD, for all the work that he's been doing. Definitely deserves it. Okay, so let's say in a fiqh book, you would say the first chapter would be purification, and they would go in details in purification, but that's what would be called the fiqh of worship. We had already completed everything in fiqh of worship. We also did the prayers. That's also part of fiqh of worship. And then, of course, then it talks about, let's say, fasting, and it goes in details, and zakah goes in details. Definitely, if you want to learn at least about fiqh, you know what? Even if you don't want to go in details, absolutely recommend going to this book and kind of like getting the keys to learning fiqh and just taking it one at a time and learning the different chapters on fiqh. You could see Fiqh of Marriage, and certainly we've got a lot of things to cover. So 452 begins in 300 and let me say, hold on, 367 to 452. So almost 100 pages. Okay. And then we've got business and transactions. We're not going to talk about business and transactions, but we're going to basically just cover the chapter in regards to marriage. And certainly if you're talking about marriage, you've got a lot of topics to talk about. But what we'll be doing, inshallah, we may be jumping. So we may be jumping in these presentations right there. Let's look at these presentations right there. So we've got intro to marriage, engagement and its rulings. We've got happy marriage and what that actually means. We also have different methods used in technology, modern methods for proposing and proposals, engagement, qualifications and engagement, women men cannot propose to, forced women into a marriage, giving advice and mentoring others or mentioning others' faults, happy marriage, having someone act on a man's behalf. Some of those slides were actually repeated, which is, making it easier for us to basically get an update. Marriage contracts, different types, and anyhow, so this is just an idea about what we'll be doing. But of course, we'll be using different types of different types of material, but inshallah, that's to give you multiple references. Some people like slides, other people do not like slides and prefer a textbook in front of them. So this is the textbook right there, okay? But certainly the textbook will be a summary of what we're doing, because the details that we'll be giving, inshallah, will be recorded on YouTube. It will also be available. Definitely, I highly recommend registering for the class at Gems of Light website, simply because if you take the test, you can get credit for it. And inshallah, maybe get your degree, your kind of like a bachelor's or, an associate degree in Islamic studies, not a bachelor's, but an associate degree from Gems of Light. So yeah, you will be, inshallah, at least get yourself at least the basics of learning Islam. And at the same time, once you get that degree, it helps you know your own qualification, and it helps to give you confidence when you want to teach Islam. It gives you confidence on, where am I? Did I take what I needed to take in order to really be at that place, teaching Islam at least, or giving those classes. The link to the registration is basically gemsoflight.org. So let me see. Nora was supposed to be here, so let's see right there, gemsoflight.org. And can you actually see what I'm doing is the question? Yes, you can. Okay. And then there you go. This is the website, and then view details and all of that. If you cannot afford to pay, don't worry about it. Just ask for a scholarship, and inshallah, we'll let that pass. If you're able to pay, that's one way to help basically Gems of Light continue what they're doing. If you're able to pay, that would be something that consider it as a sadaqah on your behalf. If you're not able to pay, just join the class, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will set those that will give the support on you. Make dua for whoever is sponsoring this. Okay. All right. Like we said, a lot of topics to cover. You can actually use the book, or you could also use the slides, and definitely the YouTube videos are recorded. They're recorded on YouTube, so we'll be having them in a separate kind of like a playlist for Fiqh of Marriage, and we'll also be doing the live session that we will be doing, inshallah, Friday to you, but Saturday to me, and Monday to me, and Sunday to you, at pretty much this time, half an hour, 34 minutes from now. So if there are any questions before we start, go ahead. How long is the class? 2 hours, 2 hours every single class. I know it's probably too long. I don't mind shrinking it to an hour and a half if that's what you prefer. I don't mind. We can do a vote and say whether you would like an hour and a half, or whether you would like it to stay 2 hours as well. I don't mind either way. Okay. Yeah. I know I've had some people actually say they wanted it to be an hour and a half instead of 2. So if we get enough votes, inshallah, we'll make it into an hour and a half, if that's what everybody wants. If everybody wants an hour and make it into 3 classes a week, that's also fine with me as well. Okay. All right. So meanwhile, you can have your voices heard. Let's see. Tell me in the chat what you prefer, and inshallah, we'll take in consideration. Okay, let's start and speak about, inshallah, Fiqh of Marriage. Before we start speaking about Fiqh of Marriage, I want you to look at this map right here. Okay, I want you to look at this map. Although this map is not 100% accurate, but I love how they made it into something that is visual for us to kind of see and get an idea of where those madhahib are at, and what fiqh really means, and all of that. So hold on. When we speak about fiqh, of course, the class is called family fiqh, okay? But, the word family fiqh, that's not how in the early books of fiqh, that's not what they really called it. They used to call it bab nikah. Bab nikah. Okay, what does that mean? The word bab means chapter or door, okay? And it would be part of the different chapters of fiqh, just like you would see in this book. Okay, maybe I can give you an idea right there. Maybe we could say right there, maybe fiqh al-Islami. No, I want something smaller. Maybe fiqh al-Sunnah. Here we go. Fiqh al-Sunnah. And I want you to kind of see how this would look like. Okay, let's see right there. And yeah, that's probably one of those probably easiest books to go to, even though, yeah, it could say right there. So, and they would, let's go right there. I'm going to just give you an idea right there. Maybe this is the glossary. Is it? No, it's not. Okay, give me the glossary. Okay, it didn't give me the glossary, but just to, this is just 1 out of 3 volumes. Okay, here we go. So now it basically is giving me just right there, telling me about here, wasiya, about will and all of that. And, pretty much the same thing that you would see in this book right there. So it would give you just different topics, but it is split into different chapters. Okay. So the chapters, they would start with purification, go for worship and the different things about worship, then go for siyam, then go for zakah, then go for marriage, then go for transactions, then go for the different rulings on judging and all of that, and then go for fara'id, which is basically inheritance. Then after inheritance, it will go for the rulings on international law and all these different things. So basically just an idea about fiqh. So what does the word fiqh actually mean? So the word fiqh itself actually means to understand. So literally, it means to understand, okay? But later it became a specific topic that you're understanding basically Islam on. And that specific topic became the Islamic legislature. In other words, we're talking about human behavior, how we would judge whether this is right, whether this is wrong, whether this is permissible, not permissible, whether this is considering probably needing a compensation, not a compensation. Is this somebody's responsibility? Is this somebody's rights, etc.? So in other words, we're talking about specifically about human behavior, and we're speaking about going to the references, whether we're speaking about the reference in terms of Quran. So we go back to the Quran in terms of that's the first evidence we would use. And then number 2, we would go back to Sunnah, which basically is the prophetic tradition. And along with the Sunnah, we may get into other evidences that I would say range within Sunnah, which is the companions themselves and what they had basically taught us about Sunnah. So we'll get into saying, well, this is what Umar ibn al-Khattab had mentioned. This is what, let's say, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had ruled, even though we don't have a lot of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq's, because he only ruled for a year and 9 months, so that wasn't too long. Almost 2 years. Okay. And plus he only had mentioned, I believe it was only 57 ahadith. So we don't really have a lot of references on Abu Bakr Siddiq, but we do have definitely other Sahaba that we already know were references in that regard. So we've got Sunnah, and a subcategory would be the Sahaba. And then another subcategory would be what is called the tabi'in. Who are tabi'in? So we got scholars like Mujahid, we got scholars like Sa'id ibn Jubayr, Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab, just different scholars that were, let's call them students of the companions themselves. Okay, so we got stage 1, we got the Prophet ﷺ. And number 2, we would basically have the companions who had met the Prophet ﷺ. Okay. In stage 3, we would talk about the tabi'in, which basically are the figures that had met the Sahaba. Okay. So let's, break it down really quick and write those as, those points. and just make sure that we're on the same page. So I'm going to give you right there just some references right there. So we said, in terms of references, we're going to go to Al-Quran. Number two, we're going to go to Sunnah. And number three, as a subcategory, we're basically going to go to the Sahaba. We're going to, if available, not always would you have evidences on Sahaba and what they had said. And then the Tabi'in, and then that combo would actually make a madhab, okay? That combo would make a madhab. So what do I mean by that combo would make a madhab? When you look at the different madhab, when you look at the word madhab comes from the root dhahaba, which means a path, okay? But the scholars that came later, okay? The scholars that came later, whether we're speaking about Hanafi, we're speaking about Maliki, we're speaking about Shafi'i, we're talking about Ahmad ibn Hanbal, but guess what? You know, those are the famous madhahib. Those aren't all the madhahib, okay? Those aren't all the schools, but those are the four famous schools, but there were many other schools, even more than 16, okay? But they just didn't happen to become, let's say, recorded or something that was passed on to you that you are well acquainted of or well or even available, because the students didn't do a good job in passing it on or probably putting it in, let's consider it as a reference, and therefore their information pretty much became lost and it didn't get the appreciation that it deserves. Okay, so this is in regards to madhab. Okay, we will be talking about, let's say, I'm going to write those down. Okay, so we've got the madhab. The first one, madhab Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa died in 150-year hijrah. Okay, so why are we even mentioning the dates right there? Because it kind of gives you an overview of what we're talking about in terms of context, of place and time, and the most important thing, the available resources that he had. So Imam Abu Hanifa, he didn't have the resources of like al-Bukhari and Muslim available, okay? And what that means is that the whole thing about is Sunnah as a reference, he didn't fully have it available. So that's why they were actually known to being Ahlul Ra'i, okay? But that doesn't mean that they were people of opinion. They didn't depend on their own opinion, but they did use the different paradigms, the different standards, the different resources that they had known at least being authentic, and certainly did go back to Quran, and when available of an authentic Sunnah, they would definitely use that because they had all agreed إذا صح الحديث فهو مذهبي. If a hadith had been proven authentic, then that's going to be my madhab, my go-to, basically, opinion, and that's going to be the reference that I would consider as the evidence that I would consider as the basically the fatwa in that regards. Okay, number two is basically Malik ibn Anas. Malik ibn Anas, he died 179 Hijriya. Once again, why is that important? Because it kind of gives you an idea that he died after Abu Hanifa. So, but this guy actually lived in Iraq. In other words, references that he had were not the same references as the person that basically lived in Medina, okay? Imam Malik lived in Medina and in fact never left in Medina but wants to go for Hajj and stayed in Medina. And that basically gives him definitely a lot more resources, available resources in terms of one, Sunnah, in terms of Sahaba, and in terms of Tabi'in. And definitely, yes, he didn't meet any Sahabi, but he definitely met some Tabi'in, gave him some resources. Let's give an idea. The Prophet ﷺ had died in 11-year hijrah. Okay, the Prophet ﷺ dies in 11-year Hijrah, and then you would see the different Sahaba right there. No, they didn't make it to, definitely didn't make it till the birth of Malik ibn Anas, but the Tabi'een did, and that's when he basically had access to them. Number 3 is Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i. Let me write down his name. Muhammad and Ibn Idris al-Shafi'i. Okay, and just an idea about al-Shafi'i. Al-Shafi'i was born in Gaza. Gaza, the city that is right now going through genocide. Yes, Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i was born in Gaza, but he was not Palestinian. He was originally Qurashi. He was originally from Mecca, but his father went to Gaza. When his father went to Gaza, and basically at age 2, his father dies. His mother then decided to take him back to basically his family and go back out of Gaza to Mecca. Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, he basically benefits from who? Basically benefits from a very important scholar, and that is basically the student of Abu Hanifa, and his name was Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. Okay, and I don't want to get you in too many names, but if you remember these, man, you are going to see how fiqh just would become the most beautiful clay that you can play with. Fiqh is so beautiful and it's so fun to read. Wallahi al-Azim, if you give yourself some time to just review and memorize this, remember, طلب العلم requires 1, first listening, 2, memorizing, 3, understanding, and 4, teaching and reviewing. Okay, all of these things, they're extremely necessary. It's not enough to just attend the lecture. You really need to take notes, and after those times that you would take those notes, take the time to study them, take the time to memorize them, and trust me, you'll then, whenever you would go into a fiqh class, you'll be able to memorize. This is what Muqatil said. This is what Mujahid said. This is what Abu Hanifa said. This is why this madhab said this. This is why that madhab basically got this opinion. It'll become so easy for you. It's like simple math. But you would have to, work out, the better you're at probably division, multiplication, and all of that, the faster you'll be able to understand probably calculus or probably algebra and all of that, because you'll have things in place and your foundation is strong. If your foundation is strong, you're going to see your build up and your development is definitely going to be even faster and stronger. Okay, so Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i basically was in Mecca. But not only that, because later Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, he basically went on a scholarship at age 9, just imagine, on a scholarship at age 9 to basically go to Medina and learn from Imam Malik. Yes, on a scholarship at age 9. Why? Because he had mastered all the knowledge of fiqh, tafsir, hadith that was available in Mecca. So he needed a special endorsement from the scholars, and also a special endorsement as well from the minister of Mecca, because Malik ibn Anas's class was not available and not easy for just any random person, and especially if they're going to be children. Okay, so it was Imam al-Shafi'i was only 9 years old when he was joining whose adult classes? Malik ibn Anas's adult classes. All right, just picture that. You know, so long for those that always tell us, well, the children need some playtime, and then they end up really wasting their energy, which is considered perhaps the climax of their intelligence, the climax of their ability to learn, the climax of their ability to memorize, and basically using it on songs and YouTube songs and YouTube videos and very silly, stupid music. But no, that was the time when Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i was basically his knowledge, his intelligence was absorbing the key ilm. Okay, key ilm. And definitely Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, also after him, basically Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Let's look at that one. Ahmad ibn Hanbal basically dies, well, 169 years. Oh, no, wait a minute, sorry. 269 year Hijriya, I think 269, if I'm not mistaken. Is it 200 or 259? Can't remember exactly, but pretty much within that area. But the Hanbali madhab, basically going back to Hanbal right there, the Hanbali madhab didn't actually exist. Why? Because Ahmad ibn Hanbal was not a scholar of fiqh. He was actually a scholar of hadith. But it isn't until later, okay, in fact, even his musnad, which is in the earlier volumes, it was 5. Right now, after all the different revisions that basically were done, and the revisions that right now are Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, if we're talking about Shu'aib al-Arnaout's revision, we're talking about almost 53 volumes. But in the earlier volumes, it was only 5 volumes. Did they add anything to it? No, they just made the script easier. And plus, they added on the footnotes, basically the references on where you can find these ahadith and whether they're authentic or not. So a lot of great revision that was actually added there. Layla, go ahead, dear.
Assalamu alaikum. Was him being arrested for a long period of time, did that affect him, like spreading the knowledge?
Who got arrested?
Ahmed the Hanbali.
Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So no, I mean, certainly with him being imprisoned, definitely, that definitely did affect the way that ilm would basically reach people. But if he didn't actually get prisoned, sometimes he'll just, be the story of the story that other scholars probably never made it out there. Okay. So sometimes a certain scholar's imprisonment, a certain scholar's challenge may actually be the reason to why later people had learned about their perseverance. People had learned about their determination, their perseverance, their commitment is what actually makes their information out there. It becomes an inspirational story for people to learn about their commitment, and that they did not surrender to any pressure, to any of those methods that may be used, not government, not political, no matter what type it is, that he did not surrender to it, and he was determined to deliver the truth no matter what agenda there was out there. Okay, so it didn't necessarily do that, because you had his own son. That's why if you were to look at the Musnad, it would always say حدثنا Abu Abdullah. حدثنا أبو عبد الله. And you would think, well, who's Abu Abdullah? Abu Abdullah is basically Ahmad ibn Hanbal. His own son took over, and his own son was the key figure to later inform us of that. There, for the madhab, just an idea, okay? For the madhab Ahmad ibn Hanbal, I know I'm just going to get just a little off track for those that would really be interested in going to the books of fiqh. I do have a whole series on fiqh. I will be doing, inshallah, in the future, advanced fiqh. And that would just be studying just the theory of how we would go back to these resources, how we would know the resources for Madhab Hanafi, Madhab Hanbali, Madhab Shafi'i, etc., and how we would discuss certain methods and all of that. So I will be doing an advanced class, but just a sneak peek. There are references that we would go back to in order to know each and every single madhab. But I'm not going to actually take you into that right now, but I will just tell you certain books that we would go back to, for example, for the Madhab Hanafi, Bada'i al-Sana'a, Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, Hashiyat ibn Abdin. Those are resources that we would go back to. But the good news is that the concise fiqh that I gave you, that book right there, it kind of gave you some resources in the footnotes, but it's available. You can go to the Maktab al-Shab and actually get it. Okay, for Malik ibn Anas, Sidi Buzaid, basically with all the different shuruh for it, that's basically the go-to. And for al-Shafi'i, we're basically going to be going whether al-Ramli, we're going to Nawawi. Those are the key figures for al-Madhab al-Shafi'i. And of course, you cannot go beyond basically the Nawawi, because he's considered as the Rafi'i and Nawawi, they're considered basically the key figure scholars, okay, that we would go to in order to really study the Madhab Shafi'i. Why? Because the Madhab Shafi'i went through two major stages. The first one is al-Madhab al-Qadim, when he basically was studying with Imam Malik. He had formed basically a certain madhab, his own, let's call it a madhab, meaning like preferences. So he was in the beginning considering him like a Maliki foundation, and then later he basically had formed his madhab, a new madhab, his own stance on things. So that was basically the new madhab. And then later on, of course, being influenced, he was actually taken and dragged because he was accused of attempting to make a coup and overthrow the government. So he was shackled and basically taken all the way, from Egypt all the way to basically Yemen, and then from Yemen basically taken all the way to Iraq. Just imagine, in this very scorching heat, shackled right there. And of course, that gave him basically the opportunity to meet with this guy, Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. And this guy is one of the key figures for al-Madhab al-Hanafi, because Abu Hanifa himself, yes, he wrote al-Fiqh al-Akbar, that book, but that's actually in Aqidah, even though it says al-Fiqh al-Akbar, like the grand fiqh, but it's actually not in fiqh at all. It is in Islamic creed. Has nothing to do with fiqh, okay? Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, and along with a couple other students like Abu Yusuf and Zufar, those were the key figures. But Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani was probably the most important figure in al-Madhab al-Hanafi, simply because this guy basically had written the most important foundations for the Madhab Hanafi. So if this guy didn't do the job, we would not really have al-Madhab al-Hanafi known to us, okay? And certainly that's a little bit about al-Shafi'i. So he had later, of course, got influenced by the Hanafi method, the Hanafi style, the Hanafi resources, and then later on, he basically moved to Egypt. And in Egypt, he basically met a very important figure who we are told was even more scholarly than in Imam Malik himself. And this guy's name is Layth ibn Sa'd. Layth ibn Sa'd was a great scholar that was living in Egypt. And in Egypt, basically meeting al-Layth ibn Sa'd, but unfortunately al-Layth ibn Sa'd, even though we are told that he was even more scholarly than Malik himself, but his students didn't do a good job in, let's say, keeping his ilm intact and keeping his ilm basically available and writing it down. So it basically pretty much got lost with time, history. It basically became something that became forgotten. Okay, so just an idea about that. Ahmad ibn Hanbal, like I said, one thing is that the Hanbali madhab, it became a madhab later, all right? And you had some scholars basically even debate. So just like if you were to go to a book, it's called Sighat Muntaha al-Iradat, and that book, it's about 9 volumes, 10 volumes, give or take. Okay. And he will basically just tell you, well, in this madhab, and that is the madhab Hanbali, that there are 9 different opinions, 7 different opinions, 3 different opinions. And even on Ahmad himself, he'll say there are a couple different narratives about what Ahmad's stance on this or that matter were. And he'll basically say 3 different opinions that we were told about Ahmad ibn Hanbal taking and so forth. And that's why we would basically go to these references. And one of the most important books for Ahmad ibn Hanbal, I would say al-Mughni. Al-Mughni is it's a huge book. We're talking about almost 8 volumes. Well, the references are going to be in the 9th volume. Okay, so we're talking about a really huge book, 8 volumes, really, really huge. But Al-Mughni is not exclusive to the Madhab Hanbali because it would also include other opinions within Al-Mughni. So it's not exclusive to the Madhab Hanbali, but of course, Ibn Qudama still considered did an outstanding job in at least keeping track and trying to present al-Madhab Hanbali. Al-Madhab Hanbali, al-Mughni is not the only reference, of course. There are a couple of references, but those are probably the most famous ones. Okay, now in terms of madhahib, where did they get distributed in? So when you look at, for example, the madhab Hanafi, although it was in Iraq, where pretty much where it originated, but you can see the madhab al-Hanafi is pretty much taking over, I would say, most of the Muslim world. Why so? So al-madhab al-Hanafi was adopted by the Ottoman Khilafah, Ottoman Empire, basically, as the constitution. Okay. So because the Ottoman Empire adopted it as the constitution, you could see that, of course, if you are a government and you adopt it as a constitution, then you would enforce that in schools. It would become something that you would basically fund in schools. You would open up basically the institutions to teach that, and the scholars would go back to these schools, and certainly politics has a lot to do with that. Okay, let's go for another one. For al-Madhab al-Maliki, you could see it's mainly famous in northern part of Africa, and they got some spaces right there in Bahrain. You got some spaces right there in Oman as well for Madhab Maliki, but this is generally where al-Madhab Maliki is. Madhab Maliki is actually one, well, they're all my favorite, but al-Madhab al-Maliki, I would say, didn't get the appreciation that it deserves, even though right now we are seeing a rise, and I will say a rise in the Maliki scholars, basically from the northern part of Africa right now being extremely competent. And I mean competent. And what I mean by that, I'm talking about scholars that are very competent as the scholars of the past. And right now with YouTube, and we're seeing right now the rise of these scholars, our jaws drop where were these scholars before? Our jaws drop at the competence, at the memorization that they had basically mastered, at the ilm, at even the ilm in Lugha Arabiya, the ilm in Quran, the ilm in tafsir, the ilm in fiqh, the ilm in poetry. Our jaws drop. Our jaws drop, where we are just amazed at how qualified and how great these scholars that at one point we thought that they didn't exist. And right now with social media and right now with YouTube and all of that, these scholars are right now coming into the spotlight, and we're all amazed. Once we had thought that the degrees of PhDs and masters and all of that were basically reflecting education, these scholars were right now coming to the surface and letting us know that what it means to be competent is not necessarily history, but is possible even during our times. Okay, so we're talking about then for Maliki, we're talking about then moving to a Shafi'i. You could see Shafi'i right there all the way. You could see, I mean, if you got Indonesia right there, 60 million right there, the biggest Muslim country in the world. And Malaysia as well. You could say Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan. You got a very good, and of course, you got some, in fact, Egyptians would even name the name Shafi'i. You got a little bit, I know they kind of did it in these dotted, I guess, kind of like a line right there. And of course, Egypt is basically all the madhab, okay? You got some Maliki, you got some Shafi'i, you got some Hanafi. Why so? Why Egypt basically contains all and not necessarily one. So Egypt basically had al-Azhar, still does, but al-Azhar today is not like the Azhar of the past. Al-Azhar was considered as the most important university that taught fiqh. And they didn't just teach fiqh based on one madhab, but they taught it based on all madhab. Just the entry prerequisite to enter al-Azhar, you needed to have already memorized al-Quran. That was just an entry level. Okay. Number two, you needed to have already memorized Alfiyat ibn Malik, so which is basically 1,000 poems. And along with these is basically al-Jazari. You had a number of different basically poems that you had, which included, of course, the foundation for the Arabic grammar. That was supposed to be the entry level. We still didn't get to anything. That was the entry level. If you didn't have these prerequisites, so think of it as today, they will tell you have to have a high school diploma to enter the university. Okay, they'll tell you with a high school diploma, yeah, you probably learned a couple things about Arabic grammar, or probably learned a couple basically surahs, or probably learned, just an introductory level. But no, the introductory level to them, that's you're going to go to the katatib. You're just going to go to elementary school and kindergarten, basically, and learn with those kids before you would even make it to the university. Okay, so that was why you would have Egypt basically containing all. Let's see the Hanbali madhab. You could see Hanbali madhab has a little secret to it in what really happened. Okay, because the Hanbali madhab, what happened was the Saudi government of today, you see the Saudi government today with Mohammed ibn Salman and all those, okay? Well, his great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers, okay, they basically made a kind of like a political deal with a guy named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, okay? Now, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, he basically went against the Ottoman Empire at the time, and considered that because the Ottoman Empire was basically adopting not only Hanafi madhab, but they were also adopting Sufi systems, the Sufi systems in discipline, Sufi systems in the government, in teaching Aqidah and all of that. And certainly Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab felt that that was bringing in shirk within the society. And therefore, he felt that he needed to fight against, and I'll use the word fight, whether we're speaking about a verbal opposition or whether we're speaking about military opposition. Well, he used both, okay, against the Ottoman Empire, and fought both using basically education and also using military power as well. And later, to make the story short, of course, the Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was actually considered as later called by the Brits, okay, by the British. They basically were the ones to name the word Wahhabi, to introduce him as a person that is coming up with a new religion, etc. And people thought that this was a new religion and not necessarily, let's call it, a branch of the Hanbali madhab, seeing basically wanting to oppose the stances of the Ottoman Empire, and whether in embracing the Sufi discipline or whether we're speaking about the fiqh, the fiqh opposition. But he didn't really oppose the fiqh as much as he opposed the Sufi discipline there. Okay, so, and that's why you would see the Hanbali madhab. But right now, because later, of course, the Saudi government of today, well, I don't mean by Mohammed ibn Salman per se, but I'm talking about the Saudi and what is called Saudi, okay? They basically had funded a lot of the books, funded basically the preaching, teaching, the universities that taught in Madhab al-Hanbali, and that was basically also giving scholarships for students from all over the world to study at basically whether it's the Medina University or whether it's al-Qura, etc. So that became, let's call it, the new hub for Madhab Hanbali, the new hub basically for spreading il Madhab al-Hanbali, pretty much one, resources, meaning publishing resources, making it available, the books making it available, and certainly the students that were going to Saudi Arabia to study there, and then they would be the pioneers to basically go back to their countries and teach al-Madhab al-Hanbali there, and certainly very competent, but of course, they don't beat al-Maliki in terms of, the competence there, but at the end, it was definitely funded by the Saudi government. So that's one thing that the Saudi government have probably, done. But that's probably good. Okay, let's see. So right now, when we're looking at Hanafi madhab, Hanbali madhab, those are just pretty much the most famous ones. But that you will have areas of madhab that's called the Zahiri madhab, pretty much in this area. I know they didn't put it in our map right there in our map, but just to give you an idea of what we're looking at. What we will be doing in the family fiqh. Why am I even talking about this map? Because culture. Stop right there. Because when you discuss family fiqh, you're going to end up talking about culture. When you discuss culture, it is so embedded, or fiqh is so embedded in culture that many times you may not recognize why, let's say, Somalis practice things this way. Why do let's say the Muslims in Guinea do things that way? Why do the Muslims in India do things that way? Many times it can be an influence from non-Muslims, there's no doubt about that. It can be an influence from Jahiliyyah, but it could also be tracing back to the madhab. Okay, so that's why it's important to know the different madhab, and especially if you're talking about marriage, it would be really important to get to know how that particular culture embedded with that madhab, and how this affects today, and how the mindset in marriage, maybe you're married to somebody It's probably Maliki, let's say coming from North Africa, they probably have certain traces of Maliki right there. Maybe in fact, sometimes even secular introduced by the French, etc. Maybe all of that, but you're not going to try to scrutinize each and every single trace and say, this is, coming from the French, this is coming from the madhab, this is coming from this. So we'll basically introduce a lot of the different opinions in regards to the different madhab in regards to marriage. And that way, you'll be able to understand the different opinions and also understand how to scrutinize the different cultures, and basically learn how to also make benefit. I'll give you an example. Is a woman that is working outside of the home, is she obligated to include as part of her income within the family expenses? Yes or no? Okay. The fast answer people would give is that no, she doesn't have to give not a single penny. Why? Because that is her money, and the husband is supposed to be the one that's spending and basically spending everything on the wife, and therefore that's her independent money and she doesn't have to spend anything. And of course you would hear on the pulpits and all of that. Guess what? That's actually the Hanbali madhab, but there are 7 different opinions on this matter. 3 different opinions just on the Maliki alone. Hanafi made it easy and said, it depends on what they agree on. They just made it easy. So this is just to give you an idea. So when I look at this and I see in our modern times, yes, we will have people that may call themselves Hanbali, even though, by the way, just on a side, just so that I won't forget, Hanbali does not necessarily mean Wahhabi. Okay. You have some people that may regard as Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab as their reference, as basically, let's call it that path, but not every Hanbali is Wahhabi. That's a very common confusion. Okay? Not every Hanbali, not every person that wants to adhere to a madhab Hanbali does not mean that they would also adhere to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, he wanted to adopt, and definitely he adopted the Hanbali madhab, but that does not mean no person that studied al-madhab al-Hanbali would regard that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is at all one of the key figures in studying the madhab Hanbali. Not one person, okay? Because he's not necessarily a reference for studying the Hanbali madhab, but he's one of the figures that did help, let's say, make the madhab Hanbali flourish out there, but that doesn't mean that he's a reference, okay? Just to make this, because many people would confuse these, and they would think, okay, so you're talking about Wahhabi. And I'm like, no. That's a very simplistic, and a lot of the simplicity really comes from the media. And we have to grow and become farther than what the media is trying to indoctrinate us in. Because a lot of what is being said in the media is really based on the very simplistic and very shallow studying, let's say, in the very shallow studies of the Orientalists that studied the Muslim world. They're extremely shallow. And when I mean shallow, I'll give you an idea of how shallow their studies are. Just to give you an idea. All right. I was one time in St. Thomas University. Okay. And I entered, it was for the graduate students, and that class was basically an Islamic studies class for the graduate students. Okay. So I come in And here I am in my hijab, didn't wear niqab at the time, okay? And I joined the class, and the professor was basically doing a class on the godfathers of terrorism. Okay, that's what the class was about. It was a non-Muslim that invited me to the class. Okay, so it was studying the godfathers of terror and terrorism and all of that. And this professor was basically, I'm here silent all the time, and this professor was convincing the students. And the students seem to be so convinced that he is so well versed in Arabic that he's capable of going to the resources to basically study Sayyid Qutb, to study Nadawi, to study Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi, and to study all these different figures, and to study all the books of fiqh and all of that. And the students, when they were presenting their presentations, ironically, and it's so sad to say, a lot of them were Muslim students, and each and every single one wanted to get the same vibe, and I would call it the white supremacist vibe. You see the Trump vibe right now? That's exactly that type of vibe. Going out there, it's like, yeah, we're going to teach you about what it means to understand human rights, what it means to understand rights and responsibilities, what it means to understand women, what it means to understand all. That's exactly the white supremacist vibe that Orientalism really carries within it. It's basically trying to tell you, we are right up there, and you are the one that is down there. So we're going to not only teach you about what you need to grow into, but we're also going to teach you about who you are. And unfortunately, we had seen even Muslim students get indoctrinated about their own Islam from these types of professors. So then the professor, okay, who presented himself as the person that knows Arabic, person that knows Islam so well that he basically wanted to educate even the Muslims on their Islam. So at the end of the class, I decided to do one thing. I spoke to him in Arabic. And I started talking to him in Arabic, and not the most classical, not sophisticated Arabic. It was just simple Arabic. And that's when his face turned red, and he said, "Can you talk to me in English? I really forgot my Arabic." That's when he got humiliated. It's like, you know what? Here's a Arabic person that is a native Arabic, and you couldn't even understand just simple sentences. Yet you present yourself like you are the person that is the master and that is right there coming to teach even the Muslims about their Islam. Unfortunately, that's just to simplify how many times media is coming in as the one to educate us about our own history, the one to educate us about our own Islam and what that means. So we have to go beyond that. We really have to go beyond that and go to our legacy, go to that legacy that they had left behind, and even go to the references and resources and learn more about our Islam from the resources and not from the media. Okay, so that's why it's very important to also learn, especially when we talk about fiqh of marriage. We're actually talking about, well, how do I understand my rights, my responsibilities, and making sure that I'm going back to Quran and Sunnah and not Western feminist or even, secular cultures and what they are basically indoctrinating us into. So that's extremely important. Okay, so enough about an intro on fiqh. Okay, any questions before we get into the real deal? Any questions before we get into that? See, no one has any questions. Everybody is okay. Let's see. What about reverts? they typically referencing Sunnah Jama'ah and not their school of thought? Would it be difficult to marry someone with these beliefs? That's a very good question. You know, one thing is that most people don't actually know what madhab they're coming from. Okay, that's what she's, you know, just keep that one in mind. So Somalis don't know they're majority Shafi'i, but guess what? You know, if you're talking about Somalia, okay, if you look at Somalia, for example, yes, you do have a large number of Shafi'i, but there were a lot of scholars that were also Hanbali. But what they used to do, because the ones that were Hanbali, they were targeted, so they would rip the first couple pages of that Aqidah book or of that book, because it contained basically the reference that this is Hanbali. So they would rip the couple pages in order to basically not be targeted from the colonizing powers, and it will make it seem like, oh, this isn't Hanbali madhab. And then that way, it would basically be something that would be available. So you would have Hanbali, you would have Shafi'i as well, okay? But that's not the only thing. To answer your question, most Muslims don't necessarily know their madhab. And you don't have to have a madhab. You do not have to have a madhab. But in situations where I need to ask a question, do I have to say, hey, I'm Shafi'i and I'd like an answer about this fatwa from a Shafi'i perspective? The answer is no. Al-'ami la madhhab lah. The person that is just a general Muslim, okay, they're not specialized in fiqh and they're not capable of going to the resources and studying fiqh. And I don't mean by, you know, going to Islam Q&A and just looking at those evidences and then making your own research right there. No, I mean you're capable of going to the books of hadith and to the books of fiqh and to the madhahib and actually studying it that way. Okay, I don't mean by going to Islam Q&A and making your own, yeah, that opinion convinced me, this opinion. If you're not specialized in fiqh, then your madhab would basically be the madhab of whoever you trust their research. If you trust the research of this scholar A in your local masjid, and you trusted their research, you trusted their taqwa, you trusted their qualification, then that's basically your area of research. Your area of research is to find somebody that is competent, someone that is basically competent in their deen, competent in their qualification, competent in understanding the situation as well. Okay, now for a revert, they don't necessarily have to adhere to a certain madhab, but it would be something that we would probably recommend, since you don't have a madhab and you're basically right now, since we're talking about marriage, we're not talking about something else. Okay, if we're talking about marriage, I would definitely recommend probably embracing your husband's madhab if you're a woman, but if you're a man, also probably embracing your wife's madhab. That way we could at least have a foundation. Let's call it a start. Okay, a start. If she has a madhab or if he has a madhab, let's at least, you know, start with that as a foundation. And that way we can pretty much get to a place that is objective, and let's consider that as our basis and not necessarily our own desires or our own hawa as basically the reference. So we can start them as the madhab, whether it's the wife's madhab, the husband's madhab. So something that we could start at least as a reference to help us figure out our marriage and what it's going to be based on. This is for a revert. But if they have a madhab, or at least they're capable of communicating certain things, or perhaps maybe a sheikh that they would agree on, that's also absolutely fine. Layla Ali, go ahead, dear. You wanted to say something.
Oh, yeah. Like the madhab that we're like for example, I'm Somali, like things naturally like grow on us, so we don't know that we're following Shafi, but we naturally like our opinions and stuff come from Shafi, and then when you try to explain it to a revert, they say, "Oh, that's not." You don't know how to explain it that it is from.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
So that's not just Somali, but that's the same thing if you were to look at each and every single country. Sometimes, like I said, the culture gets embedded, or the fiqh gets embedded within the culture. And even if you were to ask a Somali about this matter or that matter, or even if you were to talk to, any Hoyo, and you would come to her and she would say, well, this is what Islam says. And if you were to give her a different madhab, she'd be like, man, that is a bad Muslim. That's a false sheikh. That's the first thing that they'll think of, is that this is a false sheikh. Why? Because they had been so wired within the opinion of that madhab that if you were to give any other opinion, that's a false sheikh. I'll give you an example. All right. I'll give you an example. I was asked by teenagers if they had to wash every time they would use the bathroom. Well, the majority of the scholars, they would all agree that to wash is definitely best. But do you have to wash? The answer is that's a sunnah. But of course, within the Somali culture and many Muslim cultures, Egyptian, you're talking about Maliki, washing is like, it's not a sunnah anymore. It became so embedded in the culture that it became that, no, this is even obligatory. To even say it's a sunnah, that's it. You are so lenient on your Islam, that's it. They're going to cancel you out. So I had the students basically go back home and tell their mom that I had said that it was a sunnah and not necessarily obligatory. That's it. Half of the class didn't come the following week. Why? That's it. This sheikh is a false sheikh. Okay. Here's one thing. You have to keep in mind that what used to be taught as something that is sunnah, they loved their Islam so strongly that just the word sunnah, it did not mean as a let's say as a synonym, okay, to do not do, but it meant a synonym that's how you're supposed to do. Okay, so it became so embedded within the culture that it was part of the religion that many times even within that madhab, they may not even know their own madhab. So even in madhab Shafi'i would say that it's sunnah to use water, but the aunties and, they would not know what the madhab is saying. But because the teachers, they didn't necessarily say sunnah, fardh, etc. They just said, well, this is what you're supposed to do. And that's it. Everybody was supposed to do that. And there's no question about it. And in order to be a good Muslim, they needed a certain discipline. So they would discipline them into that. And then therefore, any other opinion would basically be as, oh, there it is. This is a heretic. Okay. So that's why it's important to learn the madhab. To learn the madhab gives you, I would say, the reference to learn Islam based on the resources. And I'm personally a person that is extremely addicted to knowing the evidence. I'm extremely addicted to knowing the evidence. From my early childhood, I always wanted to know, so why? What's the evidence? Why not? How do I know that that's not your own personal opinion? Influenced by who knows what? I'd like to know, where's the evidence on that? That was me. These children that are, so I guess revolutionary, that was kind of me. Okay, so why? What's the evidence? Why not? So what makes it so? And of course, being, of course, born and part of my upbringing was in the US and another part was in Palestine, and my father basically coming from El Khalil and being, we were known from the city that was known to being very stubborn and all of that. So it was always, so why not? And what's the evidence? Yeah, that I was, it's part of my genetic makeover, I guess. or genetic composition. So yeah, that type of revolutionary Palestinian, and plus, of course, stubborn Khalili side, and of course, that side of the American side also influencing me, where one thing, don't just accept everything just like that. You need to question a lot. So that's basically why I love studying fiqh. Okay, so when we study fiqh of marriage, sometimes, just keep in mind, sometimes studying fiqh of marriage can be tricky. Pay attention to this one. Fiqh of marriage is supposed to bring in solutions, but for many students that studied fiqh of marriage, they studied the science of it, but not the wisdom of it. What do I mean by that? Studying things in theory is one side, but studying it in practice and studying the wisdom of it is maturity. Keep that in mind. You can teach child about hygiene, about life, about things, but it isn't until they are mature enough to understand how to put it within the right dynamic is really what really matters. So many students, when they study fiqh of marriage, they would come in and probably debate their husbands that they have this right, that they have that right. And then I would get those husbands calling me, wait a minute, what are you doing here? You're messing up our marriage. Everything was fine until the fiqh of marriage class. It was supposed to be making our marriage basically get into stability. And here it is, it's basically going out the window. I would say, wait a minute, that was not supposed to happen. Okay. So ladies, fiqh of marriage in terms of the science of it, and what I mean by the science of it in terms of the theory of it is one thing, but it's extremely important to understand when we say different opinions between scholars, it doesn't mean that we would cherry pick the opinion that is in my favor and say that that's what Islam teaches. Because the main object of this whole class is to educate us in how we can bring about a good foundation in our marriage or even in our life, and give us a good foundation in how we can be tolerant. Let's do it again. How we can be tolerant, okay? Because marriage, it is actually based a lot, 90% of it is compromise, whether compromise from the husband or whether compromised from the wife, okay? It's compromise from both. There's no way that you can have a successful marriage unless there was a lot of compromise, tolerance, and a lot of, let's call it, mercy and affection towards one another. And always, and we'll say this on and on and on, winning the heart is more important than winning the argument. When you win the heart, trust me, you'll be capable of not only winning a person, but you'll later pave the way to having perhaps even winning the argument as well. But if you lose the heart, you just made an enemy. Even if you had been so fixated on winning the argument, you may have won the argument, but guess what? You just demolished somebody's self-esteem. You just basically also got yourself into perhaps the other person feeling so targeted by you. You just not won the heart. You won the argument, and by winning the argument, guess what you got? You may have probably made your own enemy. That's not what we want. So one of the main reasons why I give the differences of opinions between scholars is to help you see the variant opinions and how they are all valid, so we don't become rigid to one opinion and therefore fight other people against their own opinion, thinking that it's only one way or my way or the highway, that there are different opinions. So relax. If you adopt the other opinion, it's valid. If you adopt this opinion, it's also valid. So now what can we do? Let's try to bring about a reconciliation. Let's try to bring about a relationship to help us bring in and build a bridge to help us make that marriage work out. Remember, marriages are basically built into success. You build them into success. They're not born into success. And it takes a lot of wisdom, and it takes a lot of patience, and it takes a lot of understanding, not only the theoretical part, but also understanding the other person. And especially today, with all those things that are coming on social media and basically telling us about toxic relationships and telling us about, the feminist agenda basically coming in and telling us what it means to give rights and what it means to do this. And we end up basically confused about what was a feminist indoctrination and what is an Islam foundation. Why am I saying this? Because right now, we're even getting many Muslim feminists. I know it's an oxymoron, and I've said this before, but because you cannot have such a thing as a Muslim feminist, because a Muslim actually means they would believe La ilaha illallah. And they would oppose all those resources that would go against Islam. Simple as that. But if a feminist is basically saying they're a feminist, that would mean you are considering the references as liberalism and existentialism and all these different postmodernism, whatever, especially postmodern feminism. That would mean you are regarding another type of reference. Islam has its own foundation, Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Qiyas, etc. And certainly we would see feminism basically has a completely different foundation, even though certainly they won't necessarily say that they have a specific foundation. So that's why you've got all these different waves of feminism. But just that in itself is also letting us know that with this fluidity of references, that's what would let us know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا مبدل لكلماته. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, لا مبدل لكلماته. Why? Because He teaches us that one way of knowing truth is that it doesn't become too fluid. It becomes straight to the point and gets us to recognize basically the legal maxims and helps us see the world through Quran and Sunnah. That's the key thing. Okay, so you do have right now many that will present themselves as feminist Muslims and etc., and they'll basically come in and use all these different very strong rhetoric. And they'll tell you, yeah, I'm here presenting Islam, and sounds very rhetorical, very eloquent, etc. And it sounds very motivational too. And what I mean by motivational, they'll be very strong speakers, and yeah, they'll speak in revolution. I would say the same feminist vibe in revolution, and the man becomes the enemy, and etc. And then we're really, the Muslim Ummah is already divided. The last thing we want to do is bring in more divisions within our home. We are trying to make an education based on the Islamic foundation and not an indoctrination based on any influence out there, whether that was feminism, liberalism, Westernism, whatever you want to call it, if there's such a thing, okay? Or whether it's even a culture that's probably something that we thought was Islam, turned out to be not Islam. It turned out to be nothing but culture that my mama and my auntie thought that that was part of some tradition and some fiqh, but it turned out to be nothing but jahiliyyah. So we need to get all the jahiliyyahs out of our life and really know, what does Islam say? So this is just a small intro right there to give us an idea, all right? And inshallah, what we'll be doing every single day, well, not every single day, but every single basically class. Remember, it's going to be, if you're living in the US, it's going to be on a Friday night and Saturday and Sunday. Yeah, Friday and Sunday. Yeah, Friday and Sunday for you. But for those that are living in the Middle East or living in UK, that's going to be a Sunday, or even India. Okay, that's going to be a Monday morning. Monday morning? No, wait a minute. So I'm basically, hold on. Yeah, that's Monday morning for me. So yeah, Monday, well, yeah, if you're in India, that's 5 hours before me. So yeah, you'll be Monday too. Okay. And Saturday? Yeah, and Saturday for those living also in India, UK. I know UK, poor thing. It's going to be really early for them. But yeah, talab al-ilm requires a lot. But the good news is that it's recorded. So even if you're not available for the live session, listen to the recording. And if you would like to send any outside questions, you can send it in the chat, or you can even send it to me on WhatsApp. Be happy to answer those, inshallah. Like I said, it's going to be a lot to talk about. Inshallah, it's going to be very fun. And inshallah, you will really love it. I promise. I promise you will really love it. And it's going to be an eye-opener on many issues, inshallah. This is it. If there are any questions, you would like to unmute yourself, I would love to hear that. Please invite your friends. Invite your friends, invite people to join, even if they cannot afford to pay for the class. Just join. Just join. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that sponsors all of this. That's all. At the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the wali. He's the one that sponsors all the classes. He's the one that sponsors everything. That's it. Just join, inshallah. All right. So we will end for today right here and make dua. Ustazah Umayya, she wasn't feeling so well, and make dua that she would feel better, inshallah. Okay. So in order to give you the space and not be recorded, what I'll do, the last 15 minutes of the class,